Pastor Mark Howard of the Michigan Conference recently posted a video here responding to the whole Conrad Vine, Pastor Kelly situation, and he took particular issue with the, and I quote, false doctrines taught by Conrad Vine about tithing. However, this presents a serious problem because this is the same Pastor Mark Howard who has made false and absurd statements about the sixth commandment via abortion. So, if Pastor Mark is going to publicly call out and condemn the teachings of Elder Vine on tithe, then by his own standard and words, it's necessary for him to come out and, at the very least, explain his comments about killing little children. Before looking at his statements, which, by the way, are on video. For those who don't know, yes, I am a baptized, very supportive member of the Adventist Church. Yes, I do faithfully return tithe to the church. So having said that, let's just jump right into the abortion problem, and we'll begin with some historical context. Our very own official church journals document that our Adventist church officially accepted abortion in 1970 for the purpose of making money. But realizing that church members would not support this, the leaders kept this a secret. In the 1980s, evangelicals and Catholics began protesting Adventist support and practice of abortion on demand, and when these secrets were exposed in the international media, like the Washington Post here, church leaders became creative and began to claim for the first time ever that killing children is a sacred religious freedom that must be protected. Adventist leadership are so serious about this satanic belief that they appealed to the United States Supreme Court to defend killing children as a matter of conscience religious freedom. These are irrefutable, documented facts. Now, what makes the Adventist Church, specifically in North America, different from many other denominations is that ever since the church adopted this teaching from the 1980s, 1990s, both liberals and conservative Adventists support this. They may disagree and differ on every other issue, but on abortion, they agree that this is a religious freedom, etc. And so in this video, we are going to learn a very important lesson from Mark Howard. In April of 2023, Pastor Mark gave a message which you can see here, titled Discerning the Times, presented out of all places, Heartland College. So, a Michigan Conference pastor and speaker for the GYC presenting at Heartland. Got it, checking every box. He begins by talking about religious liberty, which he says, quote, is in essence the freedom to choose to be saved or lost. That's a God-given freedom, and that every Christian should espouse and should champion and defend each person's freedom to choose to be saved or lost. So, from the very beginning, he clearly defines religious liberty as having to do with our freedom to worship. Now, this is correct, and we can agree, but it will cause a huge problem in just a moment. He then brings up the whole mask mandates and COVID problems and how this was creating division in the church because people had different ideas about liberty and the role of government, etc. So he wants to address, as he says, three areas: the role of the government, roles of the church member, and the fulfillment of prophecy and our role in the final conflict. He reads from Romans chapter 13 and affirms that the government has a legitimate God-given duty to make laws and, quote, enforce those laws for the good of the society, and that not to do so, quote, would be a dereliction of their duty. Again, quote, the state or the government not only has the right, but the obligation, highlight that word, obligation to make civil laws. Now, this is already a serious problem because leaders in Pastor Mark's own church have been claiming very publicly for decades that violently killing little children by abortion is itself a religious freedom, that abortion is a religious liberty, matter of conscience, and thus beyond the power of the government to legislate. Among the many examples and problematic statements, Elder Ted Wilson himself publicly claimed on 3ABN that you can't legislate this. Religious liberty is a fundamental core tenet of Adventist theology and is entirely dependent upon the right to life. The right to religious liberty is predicated upon the right to life, because if you don't have the right to life, you cannot have religious freedom. The Adventist Church, however, has attempted the impossible by claiming that taking the lives of innocent children is itself a religious freedom. Now, that is completely absurd. And here is where we make important observation number one. When Conrad Vine speaks in the pulpit and makes problematic statements about tithe, Mark Howard is quick to loudly and very publicly denounce this as false doctrine. He says, quote, "The man is preaching false doctrine," close quote, "and for this reason should not be allowed to speak in our churches." Everyone watching this video should be asking the question, why are conservative voices like Pastor Mark so loud and zealous when it comes to tithe, but when leaders for decades openly justify, excuse, or support the violent torture and killing of little children, Pastor Mark's voice is nowhere to be heard? Why is that? He then continues and talks about, quote, "the role of the church member in relation to the government. How should we react to government policies and mandates? What should our level of involvement be in politics?" He then cites from, as he says, plain counsel from Ellen White and shares the quote, "The Lord would have his people bury political questions." He then immediately cites abortion as one of several political issues and makes a very weird, false claim that, check this out, if Adventist Christians get involved with issues like abortion, it will, quote, "get you sucked into something that has no Christian value whatsoever," and then cites the example of how soldiers in the 19th century Civil War were sucked into or persuaded to go to war over the slavery issue. But actually, according to Pastor Mark, it wasn't about slavery, but a, quote, "political move to keep the Union together." But this is false and absurd, and it's ridiculous for several reasons. Number one, just because an issue has become political does not mean we should stop talking about it. To suggest otherwise is absurd. To prove the point is our very own Adventist pioneers who openly and strongly denounced slavery despite the fact that it was a very political, divisive issue. Number two, as was just mentioned, religious freedom and every other right are dependent upon the right to life. The right to life is the very foundation of a civil society. It is beyond ridiculous to claim that Adventists should be defenders of religious liberty, but then say nothing when the very foundation of all rights is destroyed. That's absurd. Number three, at the very time that the slavery problem was occurring, there was a nationwide campaign to make abortion illegal. When the American Medical Association began its famous efforts to outlaw abortion, our very own Adventist pioneers openly praised these efforts, stating that the medical profession have taken a noble stand. And society owes a debt of gratitude to Dr. Horatio Storer of Boston, who was the director of the American Medical Association's anti-abortion efforts. Our Seventh-day Adventist pioneers were surrounded by a nationwide effort to make abortion illegal in every state of the Union, and they openly praised this work as necessary for society's good. They were joined by all the leading feminists of the 19th century who also agreed that abortion was an unjust attack on women and their children. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022 by the Supreme Court, the court cited the research of law professor Joseph Della Pena, whose massive work on this history cites from Adventists as examples of Christians who spoke out against abortion in the 19th century. Pastor Mark Howard wants us to believe that we should, quote, bury the abortion issue, yet our very own pioneers did the exact opposite. Ask the question, why is that? Is Pastor Mark smarter or more informed than our pioneers? And number four is the worst problem. There are two categories here: the actions and teachings of the government and the teachings of our very own church. Now, for a moment, let's forget the government. Just set that aside. Our church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, is wrong on abortion. The evangelicals and Catholics are correct, and we are wrong. We have publicly, very officially, supported the breaking of the Sixth Commandment for over 50 plus years. This has nothing to do whatsoever with politics, but within our own church. I am both an American and I am an Adventist. Both are true at the same time. Becoming an Adventist does not negate my being American. I am concerned both for the civil welfare of my country and also for the church, but of course primarily for my church because we are God's people. And the problem is that we are teaching error. We have a solemn mandate to tell the truth, and the truth is that the government has the God-given duty and obligation to protect the right to life. And yet, God's people, His church, have taken a hostile posture towards children and have for decades taught the exact opposite. Pastor Mark then goes on to say, and I quote this verbatim, "I've encountered ministers themselves who couldn't give you a good explanation of what's happening in the sanctuary right now, but they can tell you all about the latest abortion laws. But this also is false and absurd because you are comparing something very complex and historical to something that is very simple. It only takes about 5 to 10 minutes at most to summarize and explain any laws on abortion." Everyone watching this video knows this. There's not an Adventist preacher in the world who preaches on the sanctuary in 5 to 10 minutes. This is a great example of the power of euphemism. If we substitute the word abortion for its actual definition, watch how it changes the meaning. I've encountered ministers themselves who couldn't give you a good explanation of what's happening in the sanctuary, but they can tell you all about the latest death decree that makes it legal to dismember, torture, and violently kill little children. To everyone watching this video, let's take a moment to think about that. Mark Howard is bothered that ministers of the gospel are actually talking about the destruction of the right to life and the legalized torture and murder of little boys and girls. Now, this, as we have documented so many times previously, this is very typical of American Adventism, and I have the perfect meme for this right here. The dog sitting in the house which is on fire. He looks around, sees the fire, and says, "Society is being destroyed, but at least there is no Sunday law." In American Adventism, you can talk about the Sunday law all day long, and you are supposedly doing God's work. But woe upon you if you mention the death decree for millions of little children. The tragic irony is that Adventists will talk more about a possible future threatened Sunday law than an actual law in place right now to justify murder. Pastor Mark continues and shares the quote that the tithe should not be used to pay anyone for speechifying on political questions, and that those who do so, their credentials must be taken from him. So notice the irony here that the loudest promoters of abortion are tithe-supported leaders within our very own church. But wait, it gets worse, because arguably one of the worst statements is made at about 55 minutes in the video when he says, and I quote, "Here's the big question. What is our work to be? As Seventh-day Adventists, has God called Adventists to spend their time and energy campaigning against gay marriages, against abortion, against social injustices and government overreach, or has He called us to something higher?" Again, this is false. This is not true. He is employing what is called a false dilemma. It's not either or, but both and. Our Adventist church has a mandate to tell the truth, and that truth includes defining the proper limits of government, and the government is fully within its authority and duty to protect the right to life. We can tell this truth and preach the three angels' messages at the same time because they are one and the same. The former is just one component of the latter. Furthermore, if any member wishes to get involved in a political or civil campaign to protect the right to life, then so what? So what? There is nothing inherently wrong with doing that, and this is proven irrefutably by the story of our involvement in the temperance movement, and especially the example of Mrs. Sarepta Henry. She was the national evangelist for the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or WCTU, and when it started to campaign for Sunday legislation, Sarepta had converted to Adventism. Ellen White told her to stay with the WCTU and use her influence to win them to the truth. Ellen White also urged Adventists to use the temperance issue to unite with other churches who were actively pushing Sunday legislation. I've already made several videos on that in more detail, so I'm not going to repeat all that here. Notice that in American Adventism, you can campaign all you want to make smoking illegal, and nobody will ever accuse you of abandoning present truth. But woe upon you if you say something about protecting little boys and girls. You can preach "end it now," violence against children all day long until you're blue in the face, and Adventists will applaud you. But the moment you mention unborn children, suddenly you are becoming political. And according to Mark Howard and others, such talk needs to be buried. This is remarkable because he also says we should be more involved with, quote, preparing men and women, boys and girls, to meet Jesus in peace. He cries out, "Where's the burden for souls?" But his own church has officially and publicly for over 50 plus years been actively leading women to murder their own children. The WHO says the rate of abortion is over 70 million every year. Well over 1 billion little boys and girls have been violently murdered worldwide with the moral support of God's church. We are living during the greatest genocide that has ever occurred. We Adventists have publicly and officially supported the greatest amount of bloodshed in all of human history, leading who knows how many women to their eternal death. There is a huge difference. There is a huge difference between lost people remaining lost and going to their grave versus giving a public witness that leads them towards that eternal death. If you go back and listen to his video criticizing Elder Vine and Pastor Kelly, there is an important lesson to learn here. Pastor Mark Howard admits that Elder Vine has given many good sermons and has taught many true biblical things, but that his comments, however limited they are, still warrant the condemnation of false doctrine and the accusation of, quote, poisoning the flock. Mark Howard claims that Vine's comments about parachurch and tithe are so bad that they necessitate a public rebuke. He emphasizes that sins by prominent leaders must be called out and rebuked publicly. He said that Vine, teaching many good things, only makes the discipline and rebuke all the more necessary because, quote, that just makes the error more deceptive. That is an excellent example of the hypocrisy of American conservative Adventists. You can preach 1,000 sermons, and that's great, but woe upon you if you make even a few bad comments about tithing or parachurch. You have to be called out and publicly denounced as a false teacher poisoning the flock. Notice that when it comes to tithe, conservatives have a very high, ultra-rigid standard that you must abide by or be disciplined, but not when it comes to little children. Conservative Adventism has two completely different standards. They don't dare apply the same standard to children that they use for tithe. You notice that? When Elder Conrad Vine makes a comment, they jump all over him, but when Elder Ted Wilson claims publicly and repeatedly that abortion is a religious freedom, he gets a total pass. You notice that? When Vine says something about a parachurch, that's a huge problem. But when Elder Wilson and others claim that the support for abortion is biblical, they get a pass. Nothing to see here. When it comes to tithe, we must rebuke publicly anyone who deviates from our teaching. But when it comes to the Sixth Commandment, you can't publicly rebuke anyone because, as conservatives like to say, this is God's church, the apple of his eye. We mustn't say anything. Just total and complete hypocrisy. Conservative Adventism has known for decades that there is no way to defend the church's falsehood on abortion, so they adopt a different tactic. Notice this. Rather than try to defend it, they instead try to use distorted Ellen White quotes to make you shut up. The key word here is effect. The message and effect of Mark Howard's comments is basically shut up. Adventist church members should just shut your mouth about the killing of children because doing otherwise will, quote, get you sucked into something that has no Christian value whatsoever. And it will also cause serious problems that will damage our ability to tell the truth and evangelize. In other words, don't talk about the Sixth Commandment, because doing so will make it difficult for us to persuade the world to have the faith of Jesus and keep the commandments. If that sounds absurd, you're correct. It is absurd. And please notice the tragedy here. He is speaking at Heartland College, which was founded by Dr. Colin Standish, who with his brother loudly and repeatedly opposed abortion both in society and within his own church. Quoting from one of their books, "We are staggered by the unbelievable activism of the pro-abortion advocates where, in God's church, some have advocated it because they wrongly see it as a church-state issue." And from another book, they state the opposite of Mark Howard, quote, "It is society's obligation to protect this weakest of the weak from being murdered." So take a moment to appreciate this. The very school founded by Colin Standish now has people in their pulpit teaching the exact opposite, that defending the Sixth Commandment, quote, has no Christian value whatsoever. Furthermore, at 29 minutes in the video, citing Ellen White, he tells the story of Achan and how, check this out, how leaders in the church must search out the sins among the body of God's people. And if they don't, they become responsible for these sins. But with abortion, the problem is it's exponentially worse because the people didn't do this. The lay members didn't do this. It was the leaders at the GC and NAD who brought this horrible sin into our church, and they deliberately and intentionally covered it up and kept it a secret. They are the ones who appealed to the Supreme Court. They are the ones paid by tithe who have supported and defended the pro-abortion policy for decades in our institutions. It was the leaders at the GC and NAD who have been and remain the #1 instigators and guilty party. The very people who are supposed to search out the sin are the ones who are causing it to happen, and the people who fight the most vigorously to keep it within the church. For over 50 years, this history has been one of greed, bloody murder, and outright falsehoods and deception and lies. For decades, the conservatives who just love to cite Ellen White and who will jump all over anyone who bucks against the tithe, but will give the murder of children a complete pass. To be fair, if Pastor Mark Howard wants to come out and publicly denounce Elder Vine as a false teacher, then he should demonstrate consistency by explaining and defending his misleading statements about violence towards little boys and girls. If Pastor Mark Howard or anyone else is so concerned about tithe going to false teachers, then he should explain why his own church uses tithe money for healthcare plans that the GC and NAD openly admit are used to support drugs that cause abortion. That is an indisputable, irrefutable fact. Notice the irony here. In the Adventist church, leaders can support literally poisoning children to death and use tithe money to do so. And conservatives have nothing to say. But if you say something wrong about tithing, conservatives get really loud and accuse you're the one poisoning the flock. In closing, for the record, I did personally contact Pastor Howard before making this video, and I asked him for an explanation for his public statements, and he did not respond. I waited several weeks and then contacted him again, but still no response. As his statements are public, I can respond publicly, but I wanted to first give him an opportunity to explain himself, and he refused to do so. Anyways, that's it for today. As always, thank you for watching.